I was drawn to this painting immediately. Its vivid use of color, its sense of movement and energy. I got even more excited about it when I learned more of the story, and the story of its 84-year-old painter. By the way, one of the AP Classroom answers thinks this work channels Impressionism rather than Expressionism. Here's the College Board's explanation. Emily Kame Kungare's Earth's creation does not show continuity with the Western art movement Expressionism, which is focused on the emotive quality of color and forms. Rather, the style of Earth's creation most closely resembles that of Impressionist painter Claude Monet in his studies of atmosphere and seasonal change. Well, I can see the comparison to Impressionism, but surely this work also focuses on the emotive quality of color and form, maybe as abstract Expressionism. Oh well, I thought that in general the AP Classroom questions for this last unit were overly long, often confusing, and sometimes dubiously accurate. I've noted that when you take these questions. You'll have to practice them anyway, sorry. Emily Kay, sorry, I'm not going to keep butchering your last name, although I did look up the pronunciation, was born at the beginning of the 20th century and grew up in a remote desert area in Australia's outback in a community known, some would say ironically, as Utopia. I've circled Utopia on the map of Australia and included a photo. The dirt road is the main highway to her community, by the way. As your reading noted, European settlers established huge cattle stations in the outback, and once nomadic Aboriginal peoples were resettled forcibly on these farms, where they herded cattle and sheep. The Aboriginal peoples only regained rights to the land in 1976. By the way, our artist was deeply involved in the fight to pass the Aboriginal Land Act of 1976. She and others from her clan performed a ceremony before a bush hearing of the Land Claim Tribunal, demonstrating the powerful nature of art as evidence for connection to country. The ceremony involved retelling Dreamtime creation stories and also body painting. I've included a photo on the upper right. For 2/3 of her life, however, Emily had only occasional contact with the outside world. It was not until she was about 80 that she became, almost overnight, actually more than 2/3, an artist of national and international standing. But she had long had great standing within her own community, serving as an elder of her people and a lifelong custodian of the women's dreaming sites in her clan country. Since the concept of dreamtime or creation is so central to Aboriginal people's worldview and our required work, I'd like you to watch this video clip. You'll also get a glimpse of the landscape that our artist captured, especially the landscape after the onset of the rainy season brings greenery to an otherwise dry landscape. In 1978, Aboriginal women began making batik cloth based on traditional Aboriginal earth and body paint designs. This was a government-sponsored education program designed to help women find a source of income and, by demonstrating the economic viability of the outstations, to bolster their moral claim to the land. Here you see a collection of batiks from Utopia and one of Emily's own batik designs on the right. The highly original designs quickly caught the eye of art dealers, and by 1988, the Utopia Women's Batik Co-op had more than 80 members. In an effort to expand the market for Aboriginal art on the economic base of these communities, a gallery in Sydney, Australia provided acrylic paint and canvases to the women of Utopia. I think this is amazing. So 2 weeks later, the curators of the art gallery returned to Utopia and found works such as these. Emily's first painting, created when she was almost 80 years old. As your homework reading notes, this work was selected for the cover of the exhibition catalog as a gesture of respect for the artist's seniority, as she was the oldest artist in the community. Emily went on to produce over 3,000 paintings in the course of her 8-year painting career. In 2007, Earth's Creation became the first work of a female Australian artist and the first Aboriginal artwork to break the $1 million mark at an art auction. The painting captures the artist's vision of Earth's creation and its recreation each year as the rains bring new life to a parched landscape. The technique she and other Aboriginal acrylic painters use is called dump dots, raw stripes or dots of paint smeared into the surface. This short video clip gives a more complete description of the method, which you'll note is really a kind of action painting. And here is one of the last paintings that Emily made before her death. Note that her technique continue to evolve. One art blog I visited compared this with the works of the New York School of Abstract Expressionists and conjectured that this was further evidence of Jung's collective unconscious. Well, maybe so. Next work. I talked about this work, admittedly only briefly, back in our Asian art unit, but you now have more global contemporary context for this work. So let's make another comparison. What similarities and differences do you see here? Both paintings are abstract renderings of nature with titles that suggest what elements of nature inspired them. Song Sunam was one of the founders of the Oriental ink movement in the 1980s, and his work owes a lot to post-painterly abstraction, the same category into which many art historians place Frankenthaler's The Bay. Both artists employ a method that takes advantage of diffusion, thinned paint on unprimed canvas. In Frankenthaler's case, diluted ink in Song Sunam's work. The obvious big difference is Frankenthaler's exuberant use of color. Also, Summer Trees is produced using brushes, not by manipulating canvas through a soak stain process. Back when I was talking about Korean art, I mentioned that Korean artists were heavily influenced by artistic trends in China. Remember this Confucian-style portrait of a high-ranking Korean official? We can still see something of a shout-out to ink landscape paintings in Song Sunam's Summer Trees. What similarities and what differences do you see between these two ink techniques? Well, the Chinese work is more detailed. Smaller brushstrokes allow for more realism and more nuance, but both works rely on subtle gradations of shading that ink can provide. Both use a contrast between light and dark spaces to delineate space, although of course Song Sunam does this in a much more abstract fashion. Summer Trees also represent a movement within Korea, both to rediscover traditional artistic techniques and also to reinvent Korean art along unique national but also modern lines. It's worth remembering that Korea was occupied by Japan during World War II and invaded by China during the Korean War. It's hardly surprising that Korean art took a somewhat nationalist turn in the 1960s. I've put the author's own explanation of his motives up on the slide. I was curious about Song Sunam's reference to a Korean inkwash tradition, so I did a little research. Here are two images that I found, made almost 5 centuries apart. Unfortunately, I couldn't find an artist name for either work. Okay, snark alert. Did we really need 2 female Japanese artists who've gotten rich marketing themselves and some of the tackier elements of pop culture? Okay, venting over. I talked about this work a little when we discussed Buddhist art. Amitabha, or Pure Land Buddhism, is an ancient brand of Buddhism and is also today one of the most popular forms of Buddhism in East Asia and in the United States. Pure Land Buddhists emphasize a personal relationship with the Amitabha Buddha, who is regarded by Pure Land Buddhists as a savior. Followers of the Amitabha Buddha also believe in the Pure Land, sometimes called the Western Land, a place which provides a stepping stone toward enlightenment and liberation. So here is a 13th century Tibetan rendition of the Amitabha Buddha with attendant Bodhisattvas. Remember them? So, what Buddhist imagery do we see in this required work? The little alien elves apparently are attendants, maybe even bodhisattvas. The lotus flower is a potent Buddhist symbol. The lotus blooms in stagnant, polluted water, so it's a sign that beauty can prevail even in the ugliness of worldly desires and distractions. The lotus blossom also symbolizes rebirth into paradise, that is, the Pure Land. According to the Khan Academy essay you read for homework, I hope, the fantastical object, which resembles a playful, futuristic spacecraft with arms, may be a variation of a Tibetan stupa. Remember, sacred buildings that held relics of the Buddha. Mariko Mori started off as a leader of the Japanese kosupure craze for costume play, in which adolescents and adolescent adults used elaborate costumes and makeup to transform themselves into manga and anime figures. Cosplay has come to this country as well. I actually encountered a gang of teenagers dressed up in costumes when I was walking my dogs in a Palo Alto park. I asked them what they were doing, and they answered cosplay. I'd never heard of it, but now I'm using the term for this lecture, so I can learn new tricks too. Here are a couple of images of the artist from the mid-1990s. Mariko Mori actually began her career as a fashion model before attending art school. Most of her art, including our required work, is images of herself. This is a deliberate reflection on popular culture, but maybe more than a little self-promotion as well. I'm going to read from an also somewhat snarky review of Pure Land's opening at the Tokyo Museum of Contemporary Art in 2002. Sometime around the middle of her career thus far, Mori morphed into a New Age Eastern goddess character. The transition began with the Shaman's Prayer, a 1996 video installation in which a futuristically costumed Mori dreamily caresses a crystal ball while standing in the then new Kansai International Airport. Let's watch a few seconds of this. Now I'm going to continue with the review. Mariko Mori's spiritual affectation evolved in ambitious, three-dimensional videos such as 1997's Nirvana, in which viewers don special glasses to watch as Mori is born of one of 7 floating balls of light and flutters feathers outward from her fingertips. A droplet of, I'm guessing, life energy forms in Mori's midsection before floating off through the heavenly landscape which surrounds her. It returns to Mori and is sucked back inside her. The remaining balls of light, meanwhile, become little pastel-hued pixies, and one plays a mandolin while the others make cute little squeaking noises and hover around their beloved Mori, who is dressed in a flowing silk kimono and can fly. That, by the way, is the video that this is taken as an excerpt from. Since the College Board obviously thinks this is an important work of art, I will share a more flattering review. Mori is fascinated by the way contemporary Japanese society balances technology, fantasy, and humanity. With an affectionate perspective on her native country, she explores the way fantasy and reality overlap in contemporary Japanese consciousness. Hers is a world where cartoon characters step out of common books to stalk the real streets, and real people withdraw from their grim routine to lose themselves in cartoon fantasies. And, this is a McConnell edition, perhaps seeking spiritual enlightenment as well. And here's the artist's own explanation from an interview with the Journal of Contemporary Art. When I went back to Japan after a long stay here in New York, I thought that the youth culture was most energetic. Up to then, culture consisted of Western simulations and fakes imported from abroad. I was absorbed and stimulated, and they were original and so powerful. On to our last lecture on our required works before we begin AP exam.